All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Grand, CEO here at MedTech Innovator. Welcome to another one of our MedTech Innovator APAC Live sessions. For those of you who haven't been here before, MedTech Innovator is an accelerator. We are a global accelerator, the largest accelerator in healthcare in the world. And our focus is finding the most exciting companies, those innovators who have the technologies that we all want to see come to market and reach patients. And we want to make sure these companies are successful. And so what we do is we partner them up with some of the leaders across the ecosystem, from strategics, from investors, from service providers, from all the people who make everything work in healthcare. And so what we do as part of our program, as part of our accelerator, is we have this webinar series. We meet weekly. And as part of that, we have a cohort of companies. We have 20 accelerator companies that are here live. They're here in this webinar in our Zoom, and they're going to be able to ask questions of our panelists at the end. But now, for those of you who are here on YouTube, if you'd like to ask questions, you'll see a little box in the corner. You can enter your questions. One of our team members will relay those to our moderator, who will make sure we try to get those in during the first hour of our discussion, which is open to everybody on YouTube. After the end of that first hour, we go private for Q&A just with our cohort companies. So that's how this all works. Again, medtechinnovator.org/APAC Live is the URL where you can find out about our upcoming schedule and also watch past videos as well. So this is a great way to follow along with our cohort that we selected from over 500 companies this year. We're thrilled to have you here to join us and really looking forward to today's discussion, which is going to be on clinical trial management and working with CROs. This is a super important topic. At some point in your evolution, you're going to work with a CRO if you're not already. And you're probably going to be doing clinical trials, whether it's for approval or whether it's for post-market when you want to just have validation studies to prove the value of your technology. So we're going to learn all about that today and have a great discussion. This is going to be moderated by Frederick Nyberg, our managing director here in the Asia Pacific. So with that, I'm going to introduce Frederick and let him introduce today's expert panelists. So Frederick.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. Very good morning, everyone, and welcome. And good evening to those of you dialing in from the US, and a very early good morning to those of you dialing in from Europe. I know we have at least two cohort companies dialing in from Europe, and it's probably 3-4 o'clock in the morning there, so appreciate that. My name is Frederick Nyberg. I'm the managing director at MedTech Innovator, based here in Singapore. You just heard from Paul. The topic for today's webinar is clinical trial management and working with CROs. And I'm thrilled to say we have an exceptional panel for you today of leading experts in clinical trial management from CROs, small and large, covering different corners of the world. I will let each of them introduce themselves in just a moment. We have Elpis Barons here from Melbourne, director and founder at Elpis Barons Medical Consulting. Welcome, Elpis. She'll introduce herself in just a moment. We have Matthew Wagner, vice president of clinical operations at Proxima Clinical Research, based out of Houston, Texas, so we can get a US perspective on how to conduct trials and implications for startups in the Asia Pacific region. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Senthil Sokalingam, Vice President and Head of IQVIA Biotech, based here in Singapore, and I believe he's also Chief Medical Officer for Asia Pacific, including Japan. So I will get each of you to briefly just introduce yourselves, give us a little bit of background of your company and your role, and how you started getting involved with clinical trials. And we'll begin with the ladies. So Elpis.
Oh, thank you, Frederick. Great to be here. I'm thrilled to be part of the panel discussion today. So I'm Elpis. I'm the founder of BMC, a CRO and business advisory service specializing in medical devices, in vitro diagnostics, digital therapeutics, and the like. We typically engage clients right from the get-go, from inception through to full execution of clinical trials. Our sweet spot is early stage to mid-stage medical device companies. And whilst we're based here in Melbourne, Australia, hence the Australian accent, I have a US affiliate in Richmond, Virginia, called ABIA Clinical Research Partners, which enables us to extend our reach beyond Australia into the US, Europe and beyond. And if you're wondering why you'd conduct studies in Australia during a pandemic, we have a very speedy IRB HREC approvals process, excellent data integrity, and also a significant government tax incentive for clinical trial activities of up to 43.5%. My personal journey in the industry really started in cardiovascular research. I eventually moved to the other side, into the commercial side of the business, moved to the UK and worked for early stage medical device companies, most notably Mednova, which is an Anglo-Irish startup based in Galway in Ireland. We developed an interventional device which was acquired eventually by Abbott Vascular, which really furnished me with a huge range of senior executive global skills, all very valuable in helping early stage companies, mid-stage companies on their commercialization journey. So thrilled to be involved today. Thanks, Frederick.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much for that, Elpis. And Matt, please.
Yeah, thanks, Frederick. So I'm Matt Wagner. I'm Vice President of Clinical Operations at Proxima Clinical Research. So Proxima, we are based in Houston, as Frederick noted in the introduction. So I sit in our corporate office along with a lot of my colleagues. We focus heavily on startups. That's why we were founded, why we were created. We were founded right in the middle of the Texas Medical Center, one of the largest medical centers in the world. And we're right in the center of Innovation Campus that TMC founded as well, just a few years before we actually founded there, right in that Innovation Center and the Texas Medical Center. So we focus on startups. We work with them on early stage with regulatory activities, regulatory strategy, regulatory planning, regulatory execution, and then we work with them right into clinical trial execution as well. So that's kind of our focus, to work with those early stage startups right in the planning stages of where they're going and where they're taking their product, and then move them on through the clinic, either with clinical studies for validation or post-market studies if they're on that pathway as well. So that's us at Proxima. So background, I've been a head of clinical operations at Proxima for a number of years, and also worked at a couple of other CROs before joining Proxima. Traditionally in oncology is probably my clinical therapeutic background. Like most folks who are based in Houston, and that's where I grew up as well. You end up working at MD Anderson at some point earlier in your career in one of the largest cancer centers in the world, and that kind of carried me over into other spaces for US oncology, one of the largest networks of oncology centers across the United States, and then helped found and run their CRO business unit for a number of years at US Oncology, McKesson Specialty Health. So that's my background overall on kind of operations and clinical operations, CRO operations.
Great, thank you very much for that. And Senthil, please. I think a lot of people here are familiar with IQVIA, but please give us a
Sure.
brief overview.
Thanks, Frederick. Hi everyone. My name is Senthil. I lead. It's a newly launched department within IQVIA Asia Pacific. It's called IQVIA Biotech, and it's a specialized unit that works with small and mid-size organizations, startups within Asia, or startups that want to come to Asia. Our focus is within the region has been biotech for most countries in Asia, and MedTech, especially focused in China, Japan, and Korea, and aligned to our global IQVIA Biotech and IQVIA MedTech organization. My first foray into clinical research probably was early 2000s, when I was training to be a pathologist and worked in the early laparoscopic surgery. So I basically looked at the margins and, for tumor-free margins in laparoscopic studies done in Malaysia when I was working there. I moved through pharma, mostly in oncology, and have been in IQVIA for the last 8 years across various roles, medical real-world research, where I worked with quite a few MedTech organizations, and now with the startup and emerging organization focused CRO within IQVIA.
Great, thanks for that. And Senthil, maybe I'll stay with you on this first question. We heard a little bit about how Matt and Proxima work with smaller companies. Given IQVIA's traditional focus of working with some of the largest sponsors in the world, how does it differ working with smaller companies? And it must be a very different working relationship.
Yes.
Of course,
yes.
other than just the money they pay you.
It's different enough to warrant us to set up a separate organization.
Right.
I think,
right. So what drove you to do that?
I think one is, the excitement across pharma and medtech with startups, and startups are leading the way. If you look at clinical trials run in JPAC, so let's just focus on Asia Pacific, Japan, Asia Pacific. Yep. By 2025, more than 50% of all trials run in Asia Pacific is not going to be run by large organizations. It's going to be run by small organizations, and the focus, is going to be more on partnerships and how small and large organizations, along with governments, partner to drive innovation and research. And for us, our processes, traditionally working with large companies, is matched to them. Right, it's matched to a study team of 50 to 60 people on the client side, and we had to reinvent ourselves to sort of look at how do we match our study teams to 5 people or even 3 people on the client side, and the needs are very different because most of at least the companies that we are working with, it's milestone driven. What's next? It's a lot of communication. It's partnering with them versus reporting to them, right? Because most larger organizations think about the clinical study report at the end when they are starting off, not if my next patient is being recruited or retention. So we had, it's easier to create a team, a separate team, than to change mindsets, we felt, and we created a separate team, that looked at changing the way we work, not just from delivery, but from contracting, from engagement, across the spectrum.
Got it. Now, we're still in the midst of a pandemic, and COVID has affected a lot of things along the way here, especially for startup companies trying to do clinical work. And Matt, maybe I'll turn to you first. The situation in Texas, we hear, is challenging. To say the least. How has the pandemic affected clinical work in the US? Are elective surgeries starting to pick up again? What's the situation there for startups wanting to do clinical work, given the COVID situation?
Yeah, it's an interesting environment as it just continues to evolve, for sure. I think early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of course, stoppage of work, a lot of halting, especially as you mentioned, elective procedures essentially were put on hold for quite a while. What we found very interesting was how unique the situation was, not by state, across the United States, not by city, but really down to the institution. Each institution started to develop their own policies. They each started to, figure out how they were going to deal with staff coming in on site, and that still continues to evolve. So several institutions have over time, and they were quick to put in place essentially COVID committees within those institutions, and those institutions would set policies, and they would actually even review protocols at some of them. So they were actually had a review committee, or essentially in parallel to their IRBs, review on what was the impact to people flow. I won't just say patient flow, but people flow, meaning even CRAs, monitors for monitoring coming in and out of the clinic, and how would that affect just flow within there. So we've seen a lot of that loosen up as the first wave started to calm down. Essentially through the spring, most of our clinical sites got fairly back to normal at pace, opening up all kinds of procedures and opening up enrollment across pretty much all of the indications that we were looking at, types of clinics and hospitals. And now we're kind of seeing a little bit of tightening up again with second waves of, Delta going across sites. So it continues to evolve, especially here in the United States, where I think just vaccination rates, again, vary by city and by state, and how each of those, kind of organizations are kind of left at the state level and then at the institution level to make decisions. But for the most part, research has still continued, I would say, after the first wave of the pandemic kind of shut it down. We aren't seeing any slowdowns yet, but I kind of caution that with just a yet, to kind of be cautiously optimistic, if you will, that things will continue to proceed across all indications. So we have a variety of therapies that we work on, from IVDs, diagnostics, and COVID, other respiratory disorders, oncology, elective surgeries. So all of that's still continuing currently right now.
Got it. Thanks, Matt. And Elpis, very briefly, the situation in Australia in terms of clinical trial.
Yeah, so a changing landscape and very fragmented across the states. But I will say that the digitization of clinical trials, the additional tools that we have, I mean, really, realistically, we always love to get in and support sites because I think you get more granularity. But certainly what we're dealing with is a changing landscape. Australia's strategy is a little bit unique in that it, we've attempted suppression. But amazingly, through all of that, we've been able to continue to execute clinical studies through creative technologies and through closer relationships with both the sponsors and the sites.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to specifically some of those technologies a little bit later on this morning. But Senthil, what's the situation in Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea in particular, given the COVID situation?
Yeah, I think China, it probably earliest to recover compared to the rest of APAC, and
so pretty much back to normal there now.
Back to normal. The recent outbreaks, have put things into question, but we'll see over the next few weeks if they get controlled. Then it will be pretty much normal. I think Southeast Asia impacted the most because of technology adoption. And just the sheer number of cases in the last few COVID-19 cases in the last few months. Korea and Japan, I think as mentioned, technology adoption has been high. Virtual adoption has been high, and that's helped the process. The impact is not as bad as one would assume. However, from a recruitment perspective, that has been impacted. I can't across the board. If you compare year on year, recruitment has been impacted, depending on the disease area, right? So if you look at elective surgeries, they are lower, but for COVID-19 studies, for oncology studies, emergency studies, they've been. The impact is not so great.
Yep. Good. Well, thanks for that. Let's talk a little bit about the outsourcing relationship and how working with startups or the best way really to work for startups to work with CROs. And maybe Elpis, I'll turn to you first on this. Advantages, disadvantages on working with a CRO if you're a startup. Do you have to outsource everything, or are there some things that a startup can do in-house, and if they want to do clinical work in Australia?
Absolutely. So typically with a lot of the companies that we start engaging conversations with, they're at the very early stages. I'd say even pre-seed, pre-series A. They possibly have run studies as investigator-led studies, institutional-based studies. And so they're sort of transitioning into this more sort of robust, structured situation that we find ourselves in as professional operators, as CROs. The advantages are that typically it's a really resource question. Apart from small companies have limited resources typically, and often very little experience. And when we talk about clinical trials, it's really thinking about the regulations that govern clinical trials. So a small company, from a startup's perspective, looking towards a CRO that they can partner with, that they're aligned with, enables them to really tap into those resources. Practical things like standard operating procedures, like quality management systems that we need to adhere to. Those companies are able to lean on that. Of course, our networks, our ability to reach out to different territories, but certainly the advantage is really a resource-based. I think that's the right answer. The disadvantage is, of course, it costs more. But typically what we like to do is we look to the skill set that's available within the organisation. We always encourage our clients to do as much as they possibly can, and we work out really a relationship that enables them to utilise the expertise they've got in-house, and we come in and sort of fill the remaining gaps. That's our approach.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Elpis. Matt, from your perspective, is there any particular advice you'd want to give startups as they are looking to identify and select a CRO or evaluate a CRO's capabilities? How do they best go about doing that?
That's a good question. I think definitely advice. I would say to do their due diligence. I mean, you can't really take it lightly. How important it is to partner with the right partner. What's the right fit for them as an organization, and the only one who's going to answer that is them, right? They know their skill set, and as Elpis said, you really want to partner with someone who's going to complement that skill set, and that's what they should be looking for in the CRO. So, what services are they not capable of doing, or have procedures or resource available? So they really need to do their due diligence and take it seriously. It's not just a network relationship, right? You know of someone or had a brief referral. That's always good to get you started. But really do your due diligence and do what you should and qualify your vendors when you're working with them. Just as you would on the manufacturing side, where I think some of our companies take that very seriously, right? They would not build their product without qualifying the vendor that's supplying their parts. And they should take it the same approach when they're qualifying a service provider as well. So that'd just be kind of how I'd recommend they take that eye at it.
Yeah, makes sense. And Senthil, I'll ask you the same question. Any specific advice for startups identifying and selecting CROs and how they evaluate their capabilities?
I think Matt and Elpis have mentioned most of what I would have said. I think the only thing to add is probably, across the whole spectrum of product development, needs change and needs differ. Perhaps, in some cases, with some organizations, one vendor fits all their needs, and in some cases it doesn't. And there are different models where at some points you would want to insource, and some points you would want to outsource, depending on your needs and where you are and funding. So these are different considerations that one can take.
Yeah. And maybe staying with you, Senthil, what are there some specific avoidable mistakes that you see startups do when it comes to planning and executing their clinical work?
I think that the mistakes probably come from, as what Elpis said, not having the expertise internally, so if you don't have the expertise internally, how does one validate? I think, I think having a capable board, having advisors to help them through this process would be beneficial. And I think the strategy, so as you outsource, different organizations come with different strategies. I think validating that and focusing on what is your ultimate objective and how real are these strategies. for example, startup timelines. Organizations can give different startup timelines. I think validating this and doing some research on this would be very important.
Good. Yeah, good point. Elpis, any particular avoidable mistakes that you've come across with some of your startup clients?
Well, I think a good starting point, Fred, is Frederick. Is budgeting, not only in terms of capital requirements, but resources and timelines. And I think we're obviously conducting clinical trials, but at the end of it, someone's paying for it, and you really don't want to overpromise and underestimate, especially where you've got investors involved. So the other thing is really a lack of diligence and homework. There's so much material available online, and not only online, but also progressing to and bringing in-house specialist advisors, regulatory affairs specialists, biostatisticians, taking all that into consideration. And then I think the other thing that we're, and it's a real challenge, it's a big struggle for early stage companies that really require some form of clinical validation, especially with early stage clinical trials. So the tendency tends to be, what we often see is that companies will embark on a clinical study, sometimes through an institutional relationship, perhaps with a hospital, etc., but they're driving that and running it themselves, but really haven't thought much around the integrity of that data, the compliance of that data. And we find ourselves so many times looking back at that data and saying we can't use it. Now, we do have to submit it, right, because we're obligated to do that, especially when you're looking at the FDA, but thinking prospectively about what the requirements are and doing the best that you possibly can with limited resources to ensure that data integrity is incorporated into the company, the company focus, the core values of the organization. I find that they're the things that we sort of struggle with. Thanks, Frederick.
That's a good point. I think we'll come back to some of that a little bit later on here. Matthew, typically how in the US, how long does it take to plan a study, and how far in advance typically would you suggest a startup should engage with a CRO?
Yeah, there's always the easy answer, which is always early and often, right? I think in engaging and trying to explore the right strategy when you're coming in, especially if we have a client who's coming in from a different region and coming into the US the first time, really working with them to make sure they have the right regulatory strategy and then pairing that into the right clinical strategy to pair with it. So it does kind of depend on exactly where they're at. Within that time frame, I'd say at least around 6 months. And it depends again on exactly where they're at and how well they know their clinical strategy, but giving them time to really vet that strategy, giving time to resource and plan, time to make sure that the protocol is fully developed. I think that's one of those things that gets overlooked and gets rushed. The protocol is kind of like your study Bible, so you really want to make sure that that's been put in front of a variety of people. Just like was mentioned a minute ago as well, there's statisticians who can look at it, there's clinical operations folks, there's medical advisors, all those different folks that you can use to make sure it's planned well. And so making sure you have enough time for that. And then of course it does vary a little bit by indication. So there's always some pluses and minuses. Some indications you can get into the clinic much quicker. Exactly your strategy, we can always execute quicker, but that's kind of the rule of thumb I usually tell startups is, at least kind of think 6 months, making sure you're selecting your CRO, have time for selection of your sites, and getting really into the clinic on time. So making sure you plan that well.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks for that, Matt. Do you do at Proxima any support for animal trials and preclinical work at all?
We don't. We do have a couple of strategic partners that we work with that actually execute on the animal studies.
Okay.
So we'll often work, especially with our regulatory team, on the strategy. And then we partner with another group that actually executes the actual animal study itself. And then we'll be right there to actually then pull it into the clinic. So we've worked with several companies that we've done the regulatory advising, submitted the IDE all the way through, but while in parallel, they're running an animal study with a partner of ours.
Okay. No, thanks for that. My reason for asking is I've seen given the COVID situation and the difficulty to get human trials executed over the last 18 months or so, some startups have chosen to do additional animal trials, because that obviously has not been a problem, as opposed to rather than just sitting back and with their arms crossed and waiting to do additional human trials. Does that, to you, Matt, seem like a reasonable strategy for a startup, given the situation?
It's kind of depends, I would say, on the different situation of exactly what their use case is, right? You want to be wise with where you're using your funds. And so how valuable is that data? Is it really going to be exactly a data set that you need? Well, then that's a good use of your time. If you're really just looking to, again, get some additional data, then you kind of got to evaluate it, where's the value going for that particular study? But we have seen some clients, again, while they've had delays on getting into the clinic, they have done some additional work that they were planning to do and gone ahead and gotten that out of the way. So they're trying to use their time valuable, especially upgrading their products. Especially we've had a couple clients that upgraded different elements of their product while the trial was on delay. Then that required some additional animal testing to test a component that they implemented. So they're using the time wisely, I would say, on product development activities. And so some of that could be animal work and some of it could be in other areas.
Great, thanks for that. Senthil, for a MedTech startup, how in your view should they factor in regulatory and health economics, regulatory and health economic factors as they plan a trial? I think Elpis mentioned earlier that this is something that very often is perhaps lacking with startups. They don't perhaps think about that early enough and risk having to redo trials. What have you seen there, and what sort of guidance do you provide them?
I think for the region, at least for China, for Japan, the first discussion generally happens with regulatory teams. Firstly, whether or not a clinical trial is required. I think that's the first discussion. And as Elpis rightly mentioned, with the overall budgeting process and managing funds, right? I think that's the regulatory consultation actually eventually helps with a clinical trial strategy and understand the budget impact of the development plan. But to your second point on health economics, it's still evolving. I feel for MedTech, health economics, I think across the region, it's varying degrees of government funded or reimbursed products and in different countries. I think more than health economics, I think what perhaps companies should do or startups should do is understand the business case behind their product. What is their sort of universe of users, physicians who use them, and the countries that they go to. So I think I speak on behalf of Asia PAC. So if you look at, we have quite a few countries. So different countries have different regulations, and different countries have different peak sale potential and commercial impact. And understanding this and sort of navigating that to, depending on the strategy to commercialize yourself or to exit, I think it would be very important to pick and choose which country you go to and how much you spend for the valuation of the product. Yeah, so I think more valuation or sort of commercial strategy at the end of the regulatory and commercial strategy underpin the sort of development plan of the product.
Makes sense. Thanks for that. And Elpis, what's your perspective from Australia on regulatory and health economics and how to factor that into a trial?
Frederick, I think if we had this conversation, 2 years ago, it would have been slightly different. In that, what I always say is that when you're going to do the expense, the time, the resources to conduct a clinical study, you really want to think about clearly your critical primary endpoints. But secondary endpoints give us the opportunity to build into clinical trial strategy the ability to generate some form, I would say, a signal that there's a health economic clinical value proposition. You're really looking for some form of signal to indicate that, in fact, the value proposition you've hypothesized is correct, because ultimately somebody's got to acquire your technology. I think in the current climate, we're trying to really get clinical trials done and dusted as quickly as possible. So I think it's a balance between being, really pragmatic about getting to the next milestone, as we need to do, particularly with early stage companies. But I think it's important to really sit down and think about what additional data you can generate that's going to be really valuable to you commercially. So yes, we're focused on regulatory milestones, but how can we do that? And that's always something that we really kind of pressure test our clinical trial strategies with our clients, and to do that, need to do a lot of research, both in understanding what your go-to-market strategy is, but certainly where you've chosen those, markets that you want to enter, how can we generate some of that data? And we do that in Australia for clinical trials, ultimately bound for US markets. So where there's synergies, and where there's a possibility not to, make studies really complex, huge, if we can be creative in that way, then certainly that's always the best way to do it. Think prospectively in generating value up front.
Great, thanks for that, Elpis. And Matt, I'll turn to you here, maybe for the US perspective. Do you come across? Do you work much with startups that come in from outside of the US and have to rework some of their clinical studies, specifically as it relates to maybe getting ready for US FDA approval, or for putting together a value dossier, because they haven't done their homework initially, or typically, how do you guide those types of companies?
Yeah, I would say it's fairly common, I think, for us to work with startups coming in. They're seeking US, and then their strategy and their approval, their commercial strategy. So they want to get approval in the States. So we work often early with them on that regulatory strategy first. So a lot of startups will come in and seek that advice. So we do a lot of regulatory planning, which kind of leads into the clinical planning. But often there are those who they have developed a protocol, again, which is great. They've put a lot of thought into it. And about half the time, I would say they've put in a lot of thought and had a few advisors maybe on their board, or something with some US experience that's led to where they're going with that, either commercially or clinically. And then the other half, will have to take and essentially redesign or rewrite, or make a lot of adjustments, again, based on exactly what claim they're seeking, so that it really meets the regulatory milestones and the design of the study. And then there's the other times where they haven't thought through more of the clinical execution and patient flow within the type of product that they're seeking. And we'll have to work with them to adjust more, schedules of assessments and how that flows into the protocol. So I would say it's probably at least half the time we're working with them to make adjustments on the clinical planning. And often that pairs with, just really the regulatory strategy on exactly what claim they're seeking when they come into the States. And it does depend on, have they gotten approval maybe in Europe first and they're coming into the States, or approval in APAC. We've worked with some countries out of South Korea that brought their products into the States. They were fairly straightforward probably in a couple of those cases, and others they were a little bit unique and different. We had to make some tweaks. So we do that very often, and kind of on the regulatory planning, clinical planning portion.
Great, thanks for that. Quick message to our audience. So if you're a startup in our cohort and you have any questions, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll come to those questions during the last 30 minutes of Q&A. If you have a comment or something you'd like to ask the panelists immediately, use the chat function. Don't be shy. You'll have the opportunity to ask your questions live as well during the last 30 minutes. Let's talk just briefly about funding and what startups perhaps can do creatively to help fund their clinical work. We all know that access to capital is critical. Completing a clinical study is a key milestone, of course, that very often affects valuation of startups. But of course, running the trials is expensive. What are some of the innovative ways that you've come across, and maybe Senthil, I'll start with you, and in terms of what the startups can do to help fund trials in Asia Pacific?
I have to admit, I'm not an expert on this. What I've seen, at least, is that there is a lot of grant funding available across the world. I think US has a significant amount of grant funding. We've seen that in Singapore, South Korea as well, and we worked with a few companies that have sort of funded different stages of their product in the development cycle through various grant funding. The other way that we've seen companies fund their development plan is through partnerships. But partnerships with different organizations are becoming increasingly complicated with regards to IP payouts and the entire timeline management, the penalties associated with it. From what I've seen, at least, is the cost of the partnership strategy requires funding on its own, because the entire consultation and the timeline it takes for these partnerships to go through. But those are the only two things that I've observed. But then again, I'm not an expert here.
Yeah, no, those are each good points. Do you see startups even partnering with some of your larger sponsors and do joint trials with you from time to time?
Yes, but I think that at a certain stage of the size of the startup, we see that. I think there needs to be a proof of concept at least first. Then we do see that. But at earlier stages, I've not seen any.
Yeah. Elpis, Australia, there are plenty of grants in Australia, I believe, for this. And maybe you can tell us a bit about those and what, if a startup is not based in Australia, but let's say in Singapore or in India or in Korea, is there a way for them to access funding in Australia to do trials in Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Frederick. So I'll say yes. And obviously there are qualifying criteria. So there are two types of, so there's two sources of grants that I like to sort of think about. One is the research collaboration, and that is where you don't necessarily have to set up an Australian entity. This is typically a criteria not only unique to Australia, but if you think of SBIR grants in the US, you need to have some sort of, subsidiary or local presence. There are research collaborations, and we've recently introduced a MedTech innovator organisation to a KOL here in Melbourne, and they're part of a large multi-centre, multi-stakeholder grant. The disadvantage of that is that you need to think about control of data integrity, and typically those sorts of research collaborations aren't necessarily commercially focused, but they could serve their purpose. You could get additional data. So that's one opportunity. And then, of course, if you do have a subsidiary, there are multiple grant opportunities, not only for clinical studies, but also preclinical activities. Australia has a unique position in that we have an underutilised huge publicly funded infrastructure, and the government offers a lot of incentives for companies to come in and utilise that, large organisations like CSIRO, biotechs, etc. But the other side of it is specifically in Australia, and I know that other countries offer incentives, but our federal government incentivises economic activity to be generated here in this country in the form of research and development, and to that end offer a R&D tax credit or incentive up to the value of 43.5% for qualifying companies. And what that basically means is that if you conduct your preclinical work in Australia through a subsidiary, so it could be a shell company, perfectly legal, and it's all set up by qualified R&D tax consultants. But effectively what it enables you to do is that economic activity that is channeled through that entity is able to qualify for the R&D tax credit. And what that means is if your study is going to cost you $1 million, at the end of the financial year, you'll get around $400,000 back. Makes investors very, very happy and makes the dollar go a lot further. So these are the creative ways that we see a lot of companies, APAC, US, taking advantage of those opportunities.
Great. Thanks for that. And Matthew, I'll turn to you. Elpis mentioned the SBIR grants in the US. For a non-US startup that wishes to enter the US, conduct clinical trials in the US, what means do they have to potentially get some funding and do research collaborations? And do they need to set up a local legal entity to access the SBIR grants? I believe they do. And maybe you can share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, as Elpis mentioned, the SBIR grants, and there's other grants mechanisms in the States, NIH, NCI, various other organizations therapeutically that offer grants specific for certain indications. So there's a variety of grant mechanisms to put in place. Most of those grants do require some sort of entity or partnered entity. Also, as Elpis mentioned, that's usually not too difficult to set up, some sort of, shell entity and have that in certain locations. So that is very common for companies to do. There's a couple of just tax consultants that can help with that as well. We often put companies in touch with specific individuals to do that for them. That's usually a very small lift, I would say, for them to do. And it's very reasonable. And then for the grant programs, we often write letters of support. We're probably doing that every other month to different startups for letters of support with their grants on behalf of where they're submitting. We also go ahead and provide full clinical development costings for them that shows them both specifically what they're asking for the grant, which gives them a stronger grant to show they really have put a lot of thought into who's going to execute the study, but also then what that cost is going to be. So we take a very firm approach. We'll actually then agree to that kind of fixed cost potentially within that grant program to help do some cost containment. The other item, of course, there's a lot of venture capital groups, family office groups, and investors that are looking to partner with startups. We have seen that so much that here at Proxima, we've actually built relationships directly with different investment groups. And so we offered actually just, again, connect the dots and make connections and put people together. We've hosted actually investor dinners here in Houston, where we actually, certain conference in Houston, where we actually have the relationships that we've built and spent time just investing to make sure that we're hearing from the investors what kind of products do they want to see. And then, working with the startups that we work with and trying to actually, bridge those relationships and make connections. So being a CRO that focuses heavily on startups, we felt that was kind of part of our mission and niche, was to help kind of bridge some of those gaps as well. So we've done that often with some of our clients to help connect them to specific investors and small family offices to at least get them through, early seed funding, for initial proof of concept. Often, as Elpis said too, we can also connect them to just KOLs and investigators. And there might be an opportunity to get data for a very small lift as well. Again, those are hands off. They're usually investigator sponsored, institutional sponsored studies, but it gets you a little data that might get you again to the next inflection point as well. But we do focus a lot on connecting the investors on our side.
Very helpful, Matt. Thanks for that. Now we touched earlier on how clinical trials or clinical trial management is changing with the advent of virtual clinical trials and decentralized studies and remote monitoring and AI-powered enrollment services and so on. And I know IQVIA, has been at the forefront of some of this. Maybe Senthil, you can share a little bit about what some of these changes are, and how might a small startup venture look at some of those innovative ways of running trials, and how can they potentially benefit from them?
Mm-hmm. So I think that the pivot has been moving away from, the traditional is site-centric clinical research, where the clinical research is surrounding the site, to more patient-centric clinical research, and the technologies that have been developed are focused around that. So how can, especially accelerated by the pandemic, because patients are not going as much to the hospitals, how can we bring not just care but monitoring and whatnot direct to the patient? And we've seen that accelerate in the last 2 years, right? COVID-19 studies were, for example, the earliest to adopt this, because just the inability to run studies, especially last year, the first half of last year at a site level. And I think this is an opportunity because one, it democratizes clinical trials. It brings your patient pool expands, and a lot of our countries have adopted telemedicine and whatnot to enable at least monitoring to happen directly to the patient. The benefit of this, of course, is acceleration of timelines, right? So all these technologies have helped accelerate timeline. Accelerated timeline means you finish studies faster, costs reduces tremendously as timeline reduces, and it benefits all organizations. I think one barrier of entry, or perceived barrier of entry, of course, is cost for a lot of these technologies. At a glance, it would seem the cost is a hurdle, but then if you take it in the spectrum of development and you look at the overall cost of product development, not just cost of the technology, I do believe with the timeline reduction, the lack of dependence on site, the reduced pass-through costs that come with the use of these technologies, the overall development cost has reduced, right, or is same with the use of this technology, but with a more guarantee for timeline for recruitment, for completion of the study. The other part of non-clinical technology that, in my opinion, has definitely helped us is it's just as simple as DocuSign. I found has helped us, because if you think about how we used to run studies in Taiwan, the site contract, that whole dossier would have to go through one person it would just take a week, 2 weeks to get a clinical trial agreement signed in some hospitals. And now it's done in parallel. It's a few days, and 2 weeks off a timeline is a huge deal during startup, and can make a lot of changes. So these are some ways, but I expect this to evolve rapidly. As the next few years, and the cost of adopting these technologies will also come down, right? I think we are at a precipice of clinical technology.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Senthil. I'm conscious of time. We have less than 10 minutes left here of the 1 hour that we're live streaming on YouTube. I did want to talk briefly about some geographical considerations here as well, and get some thoughts from our panelists on running trials across multiple countries, and some of the considerations what startups should take into account when they plan trials that might span multi-countries. And also, if we're looking at, for example, a startup with limited resources wanting to do its initial trials in, let's say, a very low-cost environment such as India, can they still use data that is obtained for a trial that's been run in India when they are looking for regulatory approval, perhaps in the European Union or with the US FDA? Elpis, maybe I'll turn to you first on that.
Yeah, thank you. So it's really a planning and making sure that, and certainly in answer to your question, can you collect data for a particular indication from a single territory for approval in other markets? So the answer is yes and no, and it depends in that. The first consideration is really, how was that data collected? Was it collected in such a way that in fact will be able to be utilised for a regulatory approval? So the standards, for example, that pertain to clinical operations are ISO 14155. So if we're thinking about when we're prospectively planning a study, because we have limited funding in our own home territory, for example, making sure that we do our absolute best to get some advice around collecting that data and making sure that the study is run in compliance with those standards. Now, the other part of it is the clinical indication and patient population. So, what we often see are certain indications that really won't cut the muster in Europe, where you've got a very limited use case. You conducted your study in a narrow market, and there are genetic differences, there are all sorts of population differences, also, clinical utility, expertise of clinicians. All those factors come into play. It depends, of course, on the type of device, the class of device. So, but certainly we always encourage companies to do the best that they can, gather some initial data, get that signal, but be prepared to potentially having to repeat that study or expand on that study, in different territories. From a pragmatic perspective, yes, of course, it's more complex to run studies in multiple centres, but I think the word diligence has been used so many times during this call today. We're obliged to do really deep due diligence on the sites. So, do your homework in terms of what necessary compliance you're going to need to adhere to, and make sure that the sites that you choose are able to deliver that.
Thanks for that. And Senthil, you must be doing multi-country trials fairly frequently. What are some of your thoughts on that? And do you typically get major markets like China involved in that mix? And what should a startup think about as they plan something like that?
Just to add on to what Elpis said, it depends on the strategy and where the organization wants to go. But I think most of the time, multi-country studies are done depending on what the commercial strategy or the exit strategy of the startup is, right? So why? That's one reason. So if you're going to Taiwan, China, Korea, and there is a commercial reason for that, that's one reason. So because adding number of country adds cost, adds risk, and complicates the entire development program. The other reason, of course, is patient pool, right? So, for example, the clinical trial landscape has become very competitive, given the sort of reduced number of patients overall and the growth, at least in the number of clinical trials that are being run. That is, of course, another reason, but it needs to be balanced by regulatory risk or requirements plus timeline. So, for example, it takes almost 8 months to start up in China. So, if you are running a multi-country clinical program, that could mean you would have completed recruitment, actually started up and completed recruitment in one country, but the whole program is left open, for China's participation. So that, increasing that timeline has budget implications. But if it is not balanced by a commercial reason to do so, then there's really no need to do that. That's the only thing I would add.
Right. Thanks for that. And Matt, in terms of companies looking to get US FDA approval, what are some of their some of the things they need to consider if they want to use data from outside of the US for let's say a 510K approval in the US? What advice do you typically give companies there?
Yeah, as Elpis said, I think it's the quality of the data, overall. So you want to make sure that you can stand by the quality of the data, regardless of where you got it. So, and there are certain implications of countries that may have bias. Does that country really abide typically under GCP guidelines? And the quality of that data. But often, if clients are coming to us early enough in their planning, we often recommend a pre-sub meeting with the agency, and then just getting the agency's direct feedback. So then there's really no question. You're not putting it at risk. You've gone through some due diligence again. There's that word diligence, but you've done it at the agency level and gotten feedback on exactly that clinical strategy, and they can let you know exactly up front. And again, it depends on the product, class of device, usability requirements as well. So you might be running a study where you're getting clinical validation and usability data at the same time. So, you might also need to either run an additional US study just for usability data with your device, or, potentially US and whatever other country you might be running, which again might be useful. We've seen that with COVID as an example, where rates were going up and down. And so there was a reason to go outside of the States at a point to get some additional data on a COVID study, but while still having data on the US. And of course, that was run directly by the agency as well. So the agency knew the direct strategy and the percentage of data coming from the other country. So definitely I'd recommend, getting feedback from the agency at a pre-sub.
Yeah, good point. Now we've come to the end of the hour. I've had a lot more questions to ask. I think we'll save some of them for the Q&A in just a moment. So maybe before we close the our live stream on to our YouTube audience, I'll just ask each of you maybe to give some last final words of advice, some tips for startups in the MedTech area that are planning their clinical work. And what they should think about, if it's something that we haven't already spoken about, and then perhaps just let us know how they can reach you if they want to contact you for a follow-up. And Elpis, maybe I'll start with you.
Thanks, Frederick. I've had so much fun this morning. I think the key takeaway is really to, plan to engage CROs very early on in the piece, even at the, pre-Series A stage. Commence that process, do your research, diligence, and think really hard about the value that the clinical trials are going to generate for you. Try and build in not only regulatory outcomes, but also commercial. And in terms of choosing a CRO, of course, like all partners, and it is a partnership, we become really intimately involved with our companies. Look for alignment. So choose not only your CROs, but the sites, do your diligence. And I think, you're really well placed to kick off that process really robustly. In terms of finding me, Elpis Barons at LinkedIn, of course, you can search me up, and elpisbarons@gmail.com. I'd be happy to talk to anybody who's interested in running studies both here.
Maybe I'll ask you to put your email into the chat here for our cohort, for those who don't
I
have
will
it.
do. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elpis. Matthew.
Yep, thanks. It's been a pleasure to join. Definitely advice, as Elpis mentioned, don't be afraid to reach out early and make connections with CROs, and also to ask them for feedback early on. There's no harm in asking for them to review, different elements, whether you have a protocol, if you're already at a clinical stage, or where you're at on your product from a regulatory standpoint. There's often the opportunity to build those relationships early and get feedback, and really then start to understand the capabilities of your partner with your CRO. Because as you ask questions and feedback, then you'll understand what they specialize in, whether that's regulatory or clinical planning or clinical execution, or potentially with market and reimbursement strategies. But really try to build those relationships early and understand their capabilities early. So I know we've used diligence a lot, but I think building those relationships can go a long way. And you can often get a lot of free advice all along the way, and then you can kind of see how that develops over time. So I'm happy for you guys to connect with me as well. I'll put my email in the chat, but Matt@proximacro.com, and always happy to connect.
Very good. Thank you, Matt and Senthil.
Yeah, you've made it difficult for me, Frederick. I'm going to repeat
Yeah,
for
reducing the
everyone else.
number of pieces of advice that you,
No,
you can agree with previous speakers.
I agree with everyone. I think early engagement and clinical trial ultimately is that scientific process, to validate regulatory strategies so that the product can get into the market, into the hands of folks who need them. And so it's not all in, it's not just the clinical trial or the clinical trial strategy, it is the regulatory strategy and the commercial strategy. And as everyone said, engage us early, speak to us. We're always happy to talk to folks, to give advice, to guide the whole process, right? And I'm on LinkedIn, and I'll leave my email on the chat.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much to all three panelists. It's been a great discussion. Really appreciate it. Tons of questions we haven't covered, but we'll touch on those in just a moment. So at this point, we'll ask you all to stay on. Same for our cohort, but we will part ways with our YouTube viewers. So if you've been watching us on YouTube, thanks very much. We'll be back next week on regulatory topics,